Good evening, dear friends. We are so honored and so happy to welcome back Dr. Colleen Sen. She was here as a speaker last year, and she gave a wonderful talk on food and religion. And this time, she will be speaking on the history of religious tolerance in India. And as a way of introduction, Dr. Colleen Sen is a Chicago-based Canadian-American culinary historian. She's the author and co-editor of 8 books on Indian food and history, including Ashoka and the Maurya dynasty, the history and legacy of ancient India's greatest empire. Her books have been translated into Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. She has degrees from the University of Toronto and Columbia University, all in Slavic languages. And in the Home of Harmony today, we are so eager to learn from her about the history of religious tolerance in India. And after the talk, there will be some time for questions and answers, so have your questions ready. And on that note, let's welcome Dr. Colleen Sen.
Thank you very much, Shravani. Yeah, this is a topic that I'm very interested in. I got interested, as Shravani said, I wrote a book about Ashoka and the Mauryas, and I got interested in Ashoka via food because I wrote a lot about food, and I found that Ashoka's views on food were very interesting, and that led me to do more of them. And here's a couple of pictures. We really don't know very much about Ashoka himself. The information comes from really 2 sources that I'll talk about. And this is a carving that was made many years, centuries after he was born. And a picture on the right is a painting of Akbar. Whoops, this isn't working. Oh, wait, sorry. Whoops. No, it worked before. It's not working. Oh, now it's all coming very quickly. Okay, sorry. Okay, just a second. Oh, okay. I don't know what's happening. Can you do it manually? So the next slide is a picture of the Maurya and the Mughal empires at their height. And you can see that both of them were certainly much larger than the British Empire ever was in India. The estimated population of the Maurya Empire at that time was between 50 and 60 million. And that we're looking at about the 3rd century before Christ, BCE, and the Mughal Empire at its height had a population of 100 million, and both were the largest empires in the world at the time. Next slide. Okay, so Emperor Maurya, Ashoka Maurya, he was the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, and he was the one who really founded the Maurya Empire. We don't know very much about his personal life. There's 2 sources. There's the inscriptions that I'll talk about, and then there's the chronicles written by Buddhists centuries later, and we don't really know how reliable are and how much they really are sort of propaganda to paint him as a great Buddhist missionary. In 262, he conquered Kalinga, which is modern Odisha, in a bloody war, and as we'll see, that was very important in his development. And he expanded his empire to cover almost all the subcontinent, and he signed treaties with kingdoms in the south. And he died 238 BCE, but where and how, we really don't know. Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay, so here's a little bit about his legacy. Actually, Ashoka is very much a part of modern India. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was a great admirer of Ashoka, wrote a lot about him, and it was he who was responsible for having this wheel, this 16-spoked wheel, in the center of India's flag. And this this wheel represented different aspects of Ashoka's message, and it appeared on some of the pillars and some of the statues that he raised. And below you see the official seal of India and the official motto of India. And this again is something that appeared on some of his statues and pillars. And you can see that many people praised Ashoka, including even the economist Amartya Sen, who said that his transformation from a tough tyrant into a ceaseless advocate of kindness and benevolence and a public promoter of the social good was not only a decisive moment in Indian history, it was accompanied by his reasoned reflections that were momentous at the time and remain very relevant to the problem-ridden world of today. So if we could, next slide. Why was Ashoka celebrated? Well, not because of his conquests, but because of his renunciation of conquest. And this is expressed in his philosophy or moral code of dharma, which represented an effort to make his people live better, happy lives. And he promulgated this message on 150 inscriptions, comprising more than 30 individual texts. And they were carved in stone pillars and large rocks throughout his empire. And you can see this map, that it almost traces the boundary of his empire. And each of these is a site where he posted some of his messages. And some sites had one or two, others had many. Now, these sites were written in a script called Brahmi, which has disappeared today, and the language was actually a form of what's called Magadha Prakrit, and it's kind of a early forerunner of Hindi. And these are often called edicts, but they're not edicts. Edicts implies a command. These were really recommendations or requests, so they weren't orders to his people. They were rather suggestions about what people should do. And there is a couple of these in Delhi. One is actually right near the Ashoka Hotel. I believe one of the pillars is there, and so on. Now, in the next slide, we see what is Ashoka's dharma. And it's very different from the Hindu concept of dharma, which is really kind of the path that you should, well, it's related to it, but basically it's a system of ethics, a moral philosophy. And Ashoka himself, we know he was a Buddhist because he said that in some of his inscriptions, that in a certain day he became a Buddhist layman, he was involved in the affairs of the Buddhist Sangha, but his message is not a strictly Buddhist concept. There's no mention of nirvana, there's no mention of the Eight Noble Truths, there's no mention of other Buddhist concepts that are very central to the religion. But, and he mentions heaven, but he only mentions it in the concept that he's very ambivalent about it, whether there is actually a heaven or it just means he's bringing heaven to people in this life. So he's not really saying if you do this, you'll go to heaven. He's being rather ambivalent about that. And he makes no reference to specific castes, to specific sects, or anything like that. It's a very neutral message. And in the next slide, this is some pictures of where he put his inscription. Now, the top one, you can see, this is the so-called lion capital. That's the official symbol of India. And it also appears on some pillars, on 2 or 3 of the pillars that he raised. And the pillar itself would have inscriptions with his message on it. And he also propagated this message by special officials called Mahamatas. And he sent them around India, and he even sent them to foreign countries, bringing his message of dharma. These were not Buddhist missionaries. These were missionaries of his own philosophy. And as I mentioned, and some of the inscriptions were even written in 3 languages. They were written in Greek, they were written in Kharoshti, which is a form of Aramaic, and they were written in Prakrit, which is in the Brahmi script. And this is because in the north, the far north of India, you had the remnants of Alexander the Great's invasion, which happened a couple of centuries before, and there were still a lot of Greeks there, and there was a lot of trade with Greeks. There were Greek merchants, so he had some of his inscriptions inscribed in Greek as well. Now, the next slide shows you where this came about, and I won't read this in length, but this is a very famous inscription. And after he conquered Kalinga, Orissa, which was a very, very bloody war, and he had a lot of regrets about this. Okay, a lot of regrets. And you can see that he says, in the 8th year of the war, I conquered it. 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed. Many more died, and not only them, but their friends and their relatives and acquaintances and servants, they all suffered too. So everybody suffered, and even people who escaped from the war, even they suffered when they saw what happened to their friends. So as a result of this, he decided to renounce war. And this is unique in the history of conquerors, that someone says, I'm going to renounce it. And he says, so what he's going to do, he's going to pronounce his dharma so that his sons and great sons will not think anymore about making war. And that they should and they should not punish people. They should have mild punishment. And they should consider the victory of dharma as the only true victory, because it's a victory that bears fruit both in this world and the next. So he wanted not only him, but his descendants not to wage war. Okay, now the next slide, is it working now? Okay. Okay, the next slide I think is interesting, because in those days there was a lot of religious heterogeneity in the Maurya period. There were a lot of different sects and groups. Now, this is related to the rise of cities, because once you had cities, you had people with, they had enough to eat and drink, so they started thinking, what's the meaning of life? How do I find happiness? So there were a lot of ascetics came up, and some of them went to the forest, and some of them developed following. Now, at this time, there was no such thing as Hinduism. There was religious practices, sometimes called Brahmanism, and they involved animal sacrifices administered by the priests. So some of these ascetics attracted followers, and these coalesced into movements. And the main ones were, of course, Jainism, which everyone's familiar with, which was very strict asceticism, total vegetarianism. There was Buddhism, which was the middle way and moderation. And then you had a group called the Ajaviks, and they believed in strict determinism. There was nothing you could do to affect anything. What was going to happen was going to happen. But despite that, they were very, like the Jains, they were very, very ascetic. They led a very strict life, and even, some say, committed ritual suicide. And the fourth group is the Charavaks, and their philosophy was eat, drink, and be merry. It didn't matter. There was no point worrying about the afterlife. Just enjoy what you have here. Now, we don't know very much about these. The only way we know about these sects is through the writing of their, I don't want to say enemies, but the other groups. So the Jains and the Buddhists wrote about these, and they weren't very flattering. And eventually, these groups just died out. I think the Ajaviks might have lasted to the 12th century a little bit, but we only know about them through what other people wrote. And there were probably many more that we don't even know about. So you had a lot of religious groups in this big empire. And actually, the emperors themselves supported different groups. Chandragupta became a Jain. At the end of the life, he gave up the throne, and he moved with a group of Jains, I think, to Gujarat. Bindusara, who was Ashok's father, he supported the Ajaviks. And Ashoka himself was a Buddhist, but he also built caves for the Ajaviks. Okay, now to go to the next slide, to talk about this message of Ashoka. He didn't really call it dharma, he called it dhamma, which is more Pali, but I called it here. So the first thing that was compassion and kindness to all living beings. He wanted abstention from killing animals during festivals and rituals. Tolerance of all religious communities, and I'll come to this later. He wanted obedience to father, mother, elders, courtesy and generosity to Brahmins and Shramans, and that refers to people from the other sects I mentioned. Fair treatment of servants, slaves, and the poor, generosity, speaking the truth, and here we have the, and I don't want to, I'll mangle the Sanskrit, so that is the motto of India. Purity of thought, self-control and restraint of speech, honoring teachers, moderating and spending, avoidance of rituals and ceremonies, and fair treatment of prisoners. And these I got just by going through all the inscriptions and kind of summarizing and putting them into what these were the essence of it. Now, when it comes to religious tolerance, whoops. No, I think I'm hitting the right one. It's going backwards for some reason. Just a second. Okay, sorry. Okay, so here is one of his inscriptions. This is from one that the you call rock eating for. Is what? Oh, we did. That's the elements of dharma. That's the one I just mentioned. Oh, I'm sorry. And this is the pillar with the lion capital at Vaishali in Bihar. So that's a picture that I took when I was there. So you can, these are the distilled dharma. Okay, now when it comes to religious tolerance, this is something he really preached. And in one of his famous inscriptions, I'll just read it. He says, "The king honors the ascetics and lay people of all religious communities, but he does not consider this to be as important as promoting the essential doctrine of all religions. This can be in many ways, but this root is to control one's own speech by not praising one's own religion or disparaging that of others, or at least to do so in moderation." And he says, by doing this, a person is promoting his own religion and another person's religion as well. He's increasing the influence of his own religion and benefiting that of otherwise. And he says, concord alone is commendable, so that people may hear about each other's principles and follow them. This is my wish, that all religions should be well informed and pure in doctrine, and that their followers should be told, the king does not consider gifts or honors to be as important as the promotion of the essential doctrines of all religions. And I think that could be something that we could even say here at the Ramakrishna mission. It certainly is a good summary. But just to show how fair he was, he built these caves for the Ajaviks, because in the rainy season, they would go to these caves and kind of pray and meditate. And if you know E.M. Forster's Passage to India, you know that the key scene in this is when Adele goes into these caves and has this very frightening experience, and that's kind of makes her decide to finally leave India. Well, actually, Forster himself worked in Patna. He worked for, I think, one of the Maharajas there, and he actually visited these caves, and these caves that he describes are built on these caves that are in Vaishali, which actually I visited and took these pictures, and they are indeed very eerie, and you can, if you say something, you can hear it all across the room. They have a very strange echo effect, which Forster refers to in his novel. Now, this obviously, another aspect of his dharma is kindness to animals, and this obviously is something that he borrowed from the Jains, because this was a key factor of Jainism. And he posted this in several places. He said at certain places, no living being is to be killed or sacrificed, and no festivals are to be held here, because I see much evil in festivals. And then he says, formerly in my kitchen, hundreds of thousands of animals were killed daily for meat. But now, only 3 animals are killed. Only 2 peacocks and 1 deer. And the deer not all the time. And in the future, these animals will not be killed in the future. Now, scholars like to debate, why did he exempt these 3 animals, these 2 peacocks and a deer? I'm not quite sure. One suggestion is that the peacock was the emblem of the Mauryas. Mauryas is related to the word Moira, but I don't know why they would eat it if that was true. So whatever it is, he's going to stop doing this. And probably it's related to the other thing, is that he gave up hunting. Now, hunting is the sport of kings. That was where they spent a lot of time. But he abandoned hunting. Instead of going on hunting tours, he did tours of dharma, and he went around his kingdom talking to people. And another inscription calls for humane practices, prohibitions against, killing females that are pregnant and so on. And actually, he established the first veterinary hospitals in India. There were hospitals for people, but there were also special hospitals for animals with their own physicians, their own herbs and things. And you can see this is the official logo of the Indian Veterinary Association. And in the middle, you have Ashoka's wheel, and you have one of those cows on top. So even they adopted this. So I think that's very touching. Now, when it comes to Akbar, I have to say I am not an expert. The reason I even brought this up is that everybody who talks about Ashoka always brings in Akbar, because he too preached religion. He had different views on religious tolerance. So I'll say something about him. I did consult with my friend, Professor Hermansen, who spoke here a few weeks ago, and she recommended some readings for me, so I hope that what I say is fairly accurate. Of course, now Akbar himself, he was the grandson of the great Babur and the son of Humayun. He came to the throne at the age of 14, and he very early showed his leadership, and over his lifetime extended his empire over most of northern India. And it was really later when Aurangzeb went further south and got to the Deccan. Now, Nehru was also a fan of Akbar, and he said his reign was a blend of Hinduism, Islam, and Sikhism. And he said this spirit of synthesis was abroad, and Akbar, with his finely sensitive and receptive mind, might have absorbed and reacted to it greatly. I don't really know what he meant by that. Certainly, Akbar had no knowledge of Ashoka, and in fact, no one knew anything about Ashoka until nobody in India, I should say, until the mid-19th century, when people began to decipher the language on the pillars and the stones. He was very well known in the rest of the world, in the Buddhist world. And in fact, in Thailand, he was revered. There were statues to him in China. So he had a great reputation there, but nobody really knew much about him in India until in the mid-19th century, when they started deciphering the things. Now, his policy of cooperation tolerance, he actually had 3 stages. And the historian A.N. Basham says that he realized that the empire could only stand on a basis of complete toleration. And when Akbar came to the throne before Babur, for 300 years, North India was ruled by the Delhi Sultanate. And these were 5, I think, mainly Afghan dynasties. And their attitudes towards the great Hindu majority were very inconsistent. The Khiljis were tolerant and allowed them to practice their religion and even appointed some, but others were less tolerant and engaged in forced conversion. So there was kind of an ambivalence there. Both Babur and Humayun were practicing Sunni Muslims, but they weren't hostile to Shiites. And as a child, Akbar was exposed to both Sunni and Shia doctrines. So for the first 20 years, so there's kind of 3 stages to his, this is what I found, cooperation. The first was when he cooperated with the Rajputs to help defeat his enemies and extend his empire. Then he held religious discussions with Muslims, and then with other religions. And the third is the Din-e-Ilahi, which I'll talk about. Now, in the first stage, I'm sorry, I should have read this. This is you can see in this map, the purple at the top is what he actually conquered, and the other group was conquered by subsequent people, I think mainly by Aurangzeb. Okay, so the first stage, he needed the help of the Rajputs to extend his empire, because they were very warlike. And so what he did in 1562, he formed an alliance with Ram Raja Bihari Mal of Ambar, and he married, this is Jaipur, and married his daughter. And he later, and as a result, he adopted the same policy with the other Rajput chiefs, and they were allowed to keep their territories as long as they acknowledged him as emperor and supplied troops. And in return, they were able to attain the highest rank in his service. They became generals, they became provincial governors without having to convert to Islam. And of course, he removed the tax on Hindu pilgrims, and he also removed the tax on non-Muslims, and he ended a ban on the construction of non-Muslim temples, including one in Vrindavan. And of course, the famous thing is the famous 9 jewels, the Navratna of his court, and this actually included 4 Hindus. It included, including Tansen, the famous magician, and 2 of the Rajput chiefs, and some others. So, so this was this, and there were a lot of paintings from this period. Akbar really hired him. I mean, he had a great atelier, and many painters painted. So we have a lot of documentation of what the court looked like and what he himself looked like too. Now, in 1569, he visited the Sufi mystic Mueddin Chishti in Sikri, near Agra. And he didn't have any children at that time, and he predicted he would have a son. So in 1569, Salim, who became Jahangir, was born. And to honor the saint, he built Fatehpur Sikri as his capital. And it remained the capital of India from 1571 to 1585. Then he moved back to Delhi. They're not quite sure why, but one reason was maybe the water supply ran out. And I remember my first visit to India, visiting Fatehpur Sikri, and just was so impressed with it. To me, it was more interesting and impressive even than the Taj, because these wonderful buildings and these ruins, and this is one of the gateways that's still standing. And he built a great mosque, a hall of audience, and something called the Ibadat Khana, the house of worship, where he held religious discussions. And his policies reflected a Sufi concept called sul-i-kul, which is often translated universal tolerance to govern relations among people of different faiths. And if you heard Professor Hermansen, you'll remember that she talked a lot about this, and that even I think Swami Vivekananda actually took Sufi vows at one point. So this was a religion of tolerance. And here's a couple of these wonderful pictures of Akbar and the Sufi saints. And I just love all these pictures. They're so beautiful. And now, because of all his successes, his military successes, Akbar felt a lot of gratitude towards God. And he became more religious at this time, and he decided to consult with Islamic scholars on spiritual manners. And as some scholar wrote, his natural sense of curiosity and tendency to religious tolerance led to a desire to learn about other faiths. So then he began discussions with a Brahmin scholar, became interested in that, and he commissioned translators of the Mahabharata and later other works into Persian. This led to another thing. He wanted to find out about more religions, so he invited the representatives of other religions and sects. And he invited Jains, he invited Jesuits, and in 1584, he issued a proclamation that he does not favor any doctrine and orders the toleration of anyone's religion. And here's a wonderful painting showing this. And on the left, you can see the Jesuits with the black hats. Now, when he invited the Jesuits to speak, they were really excited. They thought they were going to get the biggest conversion of all time. So they were very happy. But Akbar wasn't interested in converting, but he just wanted to learn what other religions said and what they had in common. And on the right, you can see a picture of him with the Jains. And I think the Jains probably had some influence on him, as we'll see. And there's also said that he may have met with a Sikh leader, but that's not things. Now, he ended these debates eventually because he said they didn't really lead to any better understanding, and he closed the Ibadat Khana in 1582, and he concluded that all religions had an element of truth and led to the highest reality. So he improvised an ideology that centered around his imperial person, and it was called the Din-e-Ilahi, or faith in God, although it seems that he himself never used these terms. Now, there's no written treatise, there's no scripture of this. There's much debate on whether it was a religion at all. It wasn't a mass movement. It was strictly limited to his disciples in his own court, both Hindu and Muslim, in the upper nobility. And we know only of 18 people who actually were members. So this was not a mass religion. But the tenets were interesting because there was a belief in the oneness of God. The disciples were to respect fire and sun as symbols of life. Now, I should have mentioned the Zoroastrians, the Parsis, also were invited to the court, and Akbar was very impressed with their worship of the fire, and he had the concept that the fire and the sun really were the source of life and heat. So these were symbols that he adopted into the Din-e-Ilahi, and they had to greet each other in a certain way. There were certain rituals they had to form. They were supposed to avoid meat as much as possible, especially in their birth month. And this is kind of interesting. They had to avoid mingling with butchers, hunters, and other professions. And this is obviously some sort of a concession to the Hindu caste system, because if you look at some of the Hindu texts, these were people you weren't supposed to associate with if you were from one of the higher castes. So for some reason, this got incorporated. And he banned the slaughter of animals on certain days. Now, again, we come to Akbar's diet. And this is there are two great chroniclers of Akbar. There's Abul Fazl, and then there's Badauni. Abul Fazl was one of his great supporters. He was actually killed by Jahangir. And Badauni didn't approve of some of what Akbar was doing. But we do have a lot of information. And so and Abul Fazl wrote this wonderful 3-volume history of Akbar's reign with a lot of detail, which is much beloved by food scholars, because he goes into great details about what's in the markets, how much they cost, what fruit was available. It's interesting, at that time, pineapple had just entered. So this is really a treasure trove. And this is what he had to write about Akbar's diet. His Majesty cares very little for meat and often expresses himself to that effect. He says it's indeed from ignorance and cruelty that, although various kinds of food are available, men are bent upon injuring living creatures, and so on. And he says, none seems to have an eye for the beauty inherent in the prevention of cruelty, but makes himself a tomb for animals. If His Majesty had not the burden of the world on his shoulders, he would at once totally abstain from meat. And now it is his intention to quit it by degrees, conforming, however, a little to the spirit of the age. And it does sound a little bit like Ashoka, that, I'm going to give it up, but not now. Eventually I'll do it. And so I found this very interesting. So in conclusion, what do they have in common? And as I say, there was no question of influence, but just a convergence, I think, that both emperors ruled massive, multicultural, multi-ethnic kingdoms with many religions and sects. They encouraged and preached tolerance among different groups, but they didn't enforce it. They banned animal slaughter on certain days and limited their own meat consumption. They both gave up hunting. Akbar also gave it up, which was, for a king was a great concession. And as I said, it was just coincidental that happened. But I think it's very interesting that in the history of India, we do have these two great rulers, and that they continue today. And this is just a picture of my book, Ashoka and the Maurya Dynasty, that is available on Amazon if you're interested. And so now I will be happy to take questions. Yes.
Thank you, great lecture. I have a question, not really regarding the religious tolerance, but you mentioned about Ashoka and those kings after him, and they supported Buddhism. And I believe that Buddhism was part of Hinduism in those days, at least go hand in hand with that. And these kings who supported Buddhism, sometimes they accepted Buddhism also as their faith, but they did not leave their own kingdom for that. They just became state as a king. And
It's hard to, is there a microphone? It's hard to hear. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's just, it kind of echoes a bit.
Thank you. All right, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, join.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question was, it's a great lecture, and I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on Buddhism, especially with Ashoka accepting Buddhism, and some of the other kings later they accepted Buddhism as their religion. And at that time, I believe that Buddhism was part of Hinduism, or they at least they go hand in hand. It was a different faith. Buddha is considered one of the Dasha avatars, one of the avatars of Vishnu. So it was very close to Buddhism, to Hinduism, but it was a very ascetic living. Buddha put this faith with saying the world is impermanence and all those things. And these kings, they accepted Buddhism as their faith. They believed in Buddhism, but they did not leave their kingdom. And there is a strong opinion of what some of the historians, and I'm not for one or other, is that because they accepted Buddhism, the fighting spirit of India just vanished. The role of the king is to defend the kingdom. The role of the king is to punish bad people, the enemies. And with Buddhism, they really did not do that well. Some people would say that. And the invaders came in. There are a lot of invaders, a history of invaders in India, right from Sikandar or Alexander, and then later on several other kings came in. The Turks came, the Huns came in. So these people were not effective in defending the country, and that led to a lot of massacres in India and invasions. And that is that is something that people are talking about. Like, Buddhism did that to us, where they did not have a fighting spirit. So what is your take on that? Religious tolerance is a great belief, but yeah.
There weren't many Buddhist kings. I don't know. I mean, there were a couple, but I think the Guptas, which is India's golden age, those were certainly Hindus. They weren't Buddhists.
Guptas were not, but after Ashoka, Ashoka himself did not, he accepted Buddhism, but he did not leave the his whole kingdom.
Yeah, I don't know if that's why I don't think that's a good. I don't know whether that's what made him. Certainly, after what happened, though, I mean, unfortunately his successors weren't very good leaders. I mean, his kingdom pretty much fell apart when he died because there wasn't really anyone to succeed him. I don't know if there were many Buddhist kingdoms. I mean, there were some local rulers, but I think most of them, it kind of eventually died out in India. Unfortunately, Buddhism. There's not much now, but I've heard that argument. Yeah.
Yeah, Skanda Gupta was their last king who supported Buddhism, but he did not. But afterwards, Gupta kingdoms, they did accept some of the Buddhism. And then the Huns came in, as far as my understanding, I don't know 100%. Huns came in, and Toramal or some other Hun who came in from the north, and he invaded, and they were not able to fight him, and Guptas ended.
No, but some of the invaders from the north themselves were Buddhist, actually. Not the Huns necessarily, but what's the group that they came to? Their capital was Vrindavan. They were actually Buddhist.
Guptas were Patliputra capital.
Not the Guptas. This was one of the invaders, but I don't know. It could be, but I just think there was bad leadership. Whatever religion, they declined. They didn't have the ability that. Because Ashoka was a brilliant leader. It's just that his sons and grandsons, and they fought a lot. After he died, there was a lot of fighting over who controlled the kingdom, so it sort of fell apart, actually. So it didn't last.
Yeah, there is a story that is told about Ashoka that he donated so much of his wealth that the ministers stopped him from donating any wealth because it was a wealth from his kingdom, his taxes.
Well, that's a story from the Buddhist, and they're not reliable.
They're not reliable. Okay.
Well, that's a debate, but there's two sources. There's what were written hundreds of years later by the Buddhists, wanting to show him as the great Buddhist king, and then there's what he posted himself. And I only go by what he himself said. That's my because that's his words. So.
Okay.
But thank you. Those are good comments. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, well, you can ask me some questions during the break, so thank you.
So whenever we compare, obviously two different things come. And it was a great movement, the Buddhism was a great movement. Then obviously it changed the whole psyche of the world, and particularly in India. As because there were people in India, as I feel, the India was protected as nature. In the north, there was Himalaya, and Himalaya was protecting India from the chill wind from the north, and at the same time stopping the water-bearing clouds from the south. As a reason, it rained heavily, and there are so many rivers coming out from the Himalaya. And in many of my talks I have mentioned, and the Hindus, when they worship, they purify the water. And when they are purifying the water, the mantra, the sacred words that they say are Gange cha Jamuna chaiva Godavari Saraswati Narmade Sindhu Kaveri Jalasmin Sannidham Kuru. And the water of these 7 rivers, Ganga, Jamuna, Godavari, Saraswati, Narmada, Sindhu, and Kaveri. So the mantra means what? The mantra is supposed to be attached with the God. And here they are mentioning about the rivers. Why? Rivers are God and goddesses. Rivers are giving so much of water, fertilizing the whole land, and we are surviving over there. And obviously, when economically you are well off, you get a lot of time to think about the culture. You can think about the philosophy. So India got that opportunity. It was very well off, and they started thinking about the philosophy. Long, long back, much, much before Buddha, they started thinking about the Atman. What is this Atman? Where from we have come. In Sanskrit, there's a very famous question, Ko ayam? Who am I? Kuta ayata? Where from have I come? Kaba gati me? Where I am going to go after death? So that are the questions that haunted, and they wanted to get the result of it. And finally, they started experimenting the whole world. And when they were experimenting, they experimented the earth, the air, the fire, the water, and like that. Then ultimately they concluded, no, it is not giving the answer. Why? It is all temporary. Obviously, they dived deep within. And when they went inside, they found the answer. We are not this body and the mind. We are consciousness. And that consciousness, they gave the name Atman, Paramatman, or Brahman. Brahman, all-pervading consciousness. So when that was discovered, then they started experimenting how to reach to that. Why? If I can reach over there, I get the peace, eternal peace, happiness. The whole human life is for happiness. So they developed Vedanta. This is the whole of Veda. That is the basis of afterwards Hinduism. She is very correct when she said, at that time there was no Hinduism actually. The name Hinduism came much afterwards. It was Vedantic dharma. The dharma or the religion that based on Veda, the knowledge, a Sanatana dharma. That was the name. And afterwards, when the Persians, they were coming to India, crossing the river Sindhu, they could not pronounce the word Sindhu, they called Hindu. Sa became Ha in their pronunciation. So, Sindhu became Hindu river. And then after that river, the land became Hindustan. And like that. So this Hinduism came much afterwards. But that was based on the Veda. Buddha was born in a Hindu family, so to say. He grew up in that. Then afterwards, he took initiation from a guru. Then he found out the majority of the people are going for the external worship. They are not going for actual religion. So he protested. So Swami Vivekananda said, Buddha was a rebel child of Hinduism. So obviously he protested, he found out his own path. His path means, if you notice, all this philosophy came much afterwards. Buddha was very simple. He said there are 4 things are there in this world. That is, whole life is full of misery, cause of misery, go beyond of misery, path to go beyond. So these are the 4. And 8 steps. You should think properly, act properly, etc., etc. So mostly it is all the moral practices, as we find in the 10 Testament, the 10 Commandments. Those are moral commandments only. So like this. Afterwards, philosophy grew. Akbar came, this is very important. They came to rule, and when they came over here, they came here to establish, but at the same time, they learned this uniqueness of philosophy, uniqueness of thing. That is, she wanted to point out, and this is really, really excellent. So Ashoka and Akbar. Ashoka was already having these influences because Buddhism, Hinduism, all this, they were already there. But Akbar came completely from a different condition in the philosophy, but then he adopted, he learned, and he wanted to keep that intact in India. The speciality in India, they always say, you continue in your path, allow me also to continue my path. That's all. I sometimes say that. It is like I love my father because father loves me, father protects me, like that. You love your father because your father loves you, protects you, like that. So that means your father's name is different, your father's form is different, my father different, but fatherhood is same. Similarly, you call your God as God, or Jehovah, or Allah, or Bhagavan, whatever. But the Godhood, that's same. What is that? Love. The Muslim will also say, my God loves me. He's full of love. He protects me, all powerful. Hindu will say the same thing. Buddhists, of course, don't believe in God because they go to Buddha only. So, and like this it goes. So obviously, ultimately it is all same. But today's discussion was based mainly on history and this uniqueness that she was showing. The Akbar wanted to retain that. And that is the reason, even after 700, 800, the 100 years, 700 years, 800 years, ruling in India, afterwards, when India became free in 1947, in 1951, when they counted naturally, and they were also mentioning the religion, they found that it was 85% of Hinduism retaining. After the 700 years of Muslim rule, 200 years of British rule, Hinduism was there 85%. So this is the beauty of India. It always asks, it's okay, you come, you take my idea, I take your idea, and we grow. Thank you very much. You've given a wonderful insight, and people should think about it. The history teaches us. History, not only the record. History is always, as a teacher, teaches us what we should do. Thank you for giving us that opportunity to go back to that period and to think about it. Okay, then let us say Shanti 3 times and we conclude. Om Shanti, 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat.